Hello and welcome to the third session of Qwernomics, path-dependency and semiotic fatality with Nick Land. I'm going to pass the mic off to him now.
Thanks, Theodore.
You're welcome.
Okay, I'm going to try and be really brief and just get things rolling as far as the discussion is concerned. We ended last week with a promise that we would talk about platforms. And actually, shortly after this, a couple of days later, I had an interesting conversation organized by the NCREP with Benjamin Bratton, who Adam was referring to, raising the platform question. And I do think it intersects importantly with this whole subject. So as far as I'm concerned, we've got, this is definitely extendable, but I've got a sense of 3 topics that I'm hoping we can address at least partially this week. And the first is the platform question. And I think that one way to think about that is just to take a step back and ask the question, well, what is QWERTY? I mean, what really is our object? How are we thinking of the actual focus of attention in this course? And to what extent can this language of platforms help us to consolidate that, consolidate a sense of that object? The second topic, which also we sort of promised that we would talk about, is the Malahani material about the Chinese typewriter. Now, this tends to sort of flee off at a strange angle, I think, from our central topic, but at least because it, again, clearly intersects, I think it's worth at least saying a little bit about it. And it opens up certain things that I think are really worth at least sort of introducing. And the third of these topics, which connects, I think, to both of the others, is the relationship of Qwernomics to strata analysis. And this is something that came up talking to Ben Bratton and his book. I mean, I asked him specifically to what extent he thought he was doing in his work on the stack a strata analysis. And I think it was left a little bit unresolved. He said that he wasn't happy with the geological metaphor, and so I think that can be accepted. I'm not sure whether to what extent strata analysis is captured by a geological metaphor. I think I would tend to argue that it isn't. But anyway, I'm gonna say a few things about that because it points into areas that I think we're going to explore mostly a little bit further down the road. So first of all, I think we've got this twin question about, is QWERTY a platform? What do we mean by a platform? Is that kind of language what we're wanting to lock onto? And there's a whole set of linguistic and conceptual systems that I think get brought in quite quickly in this. We can talk about platforms, we can talk about conventions, we can talk about protocols, and I think even talk about institutions. And they all draw upon a similar pool of abstract concepts. From a philosophical point of view, my very, very strong tendency, and I think this relates to the definition that Ben Bratton gives, which was quoted by Adam last week, and maybe I should just repeat it, which is platforms can be based on the global distribution of interfaces and users, and these platforms resemble markets. At the same time, their program coordination of that distribution reinforces their governance of the interactions that are exchanged and capitalized through them. And for this, platforms resemble states. A working technical definition of platform in general may include references to a standards-based technical economic system that simultaneously distributes interfaces through their remote coordination and centralizes their integrated control through that same coordination. That's from page 42 of the Bratton book. The last part of that in particular was what Adam was pointing at us last week. There's a lot in there that is immediately gripping. I mean, the fact that we're referring to a standards-based technical economic system makes it very hard to suggest that we're not, broadly speaking, in our territory when we're talking about that definition. So, I mean, I'm not at all averse to going deeper into the Bratton material. I think I'll leave that up to people whether that's something they want to do. But as I say, from a philosophical point of view, the overwhelming temptation is to say that a platform is a quasi-transcendental entity. That's to say, it's a distributor of transcendental empirical difference. A platform works to separate aspects that seem to function as a universal form across the entire domain from aspects that are specific, local, contingent in terms of the whole. And I think this is captured in, again, just to repeat the final part of this definition that we've just seen, that simultaneously distributes interfaces through their remote coordination and centralizes their integrated control through that same coordination. So in a certain sense, I think platforms, the language of platforms, the discussion of platforms is a way to continue certain philosophical conversations that are centuries old and whose structure has been laid down at the most abstract level over that sort of time span. I'm going to just take that as a pointer to that topic and move on to this second one. So the Malahani thing, it's getting, I think, a lot of very deserved attention. It's a really interesting question. And I'm going to just bring that up in its most extreme, I think, in its most just uncompromising extreme form, which is to raise again, I'll put it in the form, no, I won't put it in the form of a question, I'll put it in the form of a problematic proposition, which is to say the entire geopolitical structure of modern history is QWERTY shaped. I'll do this really fast. Again, it's something that we can come back to if people are interested. But I think there's space here for an extremely kind of large-scale, radical, Qwernomic materialist reading of the whole structure of modernity, and it comes the Malahani stuff, which is related to the Chinese typewriter, is helpful. I think it's simplifying and captures the question in its most extreme form if we just simplify it down to this Occident and Orient, the Europe, or the European world and the Chinese world, and their relations to mechanical writing. And so I think there's a kind of undercurrent. I'm not sure to what extent this has been really tightly formalized, but there's an undercurrent of the sorry, let me take one step back and say that people have convincingly said that the great question of modern history is this topic that's called the Great Divergence. Like, why is global modernity in its kind of initial fundamental form, the first basically half millennium of globalization of the modern world, European rather than Chinese? And this becomes a pressing question just because of the fact that it seems to historians in some ways strangely unlikely. And the reason it seems unlikely comes out very clearly, I think most dramatically, in the fact that if you look at the what Marx in his discussion of the core technologies that made the modern world possible, gunpowder, the compass, and the printing press. As we've said before, this is 3 of the 4, what the Chinese within their cultural tradition call the 4 great inventions. Paper is the 4th one. So all of these inventions, which Marx says between them, they blow down the ramparts of feudalism, they produce the possibility of mass culture through mass literacy and printing, and obviously they globalize the world through oceanic navigation. All of these technologies are adopted by the West from the Orient. You know, it's shocking that there's this utter consistency that all of these things, these sort of, as I say, within the Chinese tradition, they're the classical core Chinese techno-scientific innovations, and all of them become the kind of feedstock for Occidental modernization, which then arrives obviously in the East as this shocking disruption to which the country is traumatically unable to cope for at least a century. Again, in their own terms, the century of humiliation in which they simply cannot adjust to this. They cannot adjust, that's to say, to their own technological innovations returning to them in this alien form of a self-propelling capitalistic system. And I think what Malahani taps into is a certain sense where this discussion of the Great Divergence can be run in terms of mechanical writing and therefore digitization on one side, on the numerization of language on the other hand. It's the fact that, and this is something again that Chinese analysts were very attentive to themselves, that the Chinese language provided this kind of barrier to their own modernization. Because the Chinese language resisted digitization, because therefore the whole trend towards the cultural reconstruction through information technologies was therefore in a certain sense blocked by the Chinese language, that Chinese culture itself inherently came to seem as if it was some kind of obstacle to modernization. the structure of China's trauma in relation to modernization is extremely tied up with that. I don't know if people know, but you know, in the early 20th century, sort of 1904, where there is the May 4th movement. Sorry, I think I'm moving it back too far. It's just after the First World War, so it can't be 1904. There was a large discussion among Chinese intellectuals about whether they should abandon the Chinese language completely, whether it was an intolerable obstacle to joining the modern world. And so this puts the whole question of type, of the ability to analyze language down to this small set of alphabetical characters, which therefore are in conformity with printing, in conformity with all kinds of digital technologies, at the forefront of the question of what it was that gave this massive advantage to the Occident as a kind of as a catalytic center of modernization. And Malahani's point is that there is a certain phase in information technology where things go into reverse, where computers can handle symbolic systems of greater complexity, such as pictographic characters of the Chinese type. And suddenly, as if a sort of dam breaks, this obstacle, what had seemed like this absolutely impossible obstacle to modernization, just collapses entirely. You get this just surge, this possibility of a kind of a Chinese modernity that is no longer fractured and tortured by its incompatibility with the digitization of science. I mean, I'll just say one more thing about this, which I think is also quite fascinating, is that there's also this fact that binary numeracy came to Europe, obviously, from China too. You know, Leibniz's famous reading of the exposure to the I Ching, his understanding of the I Ching as being a binary number system, and therefore his formalization of that in the West as the first articulation of binary numeracy can be added to this list of these Chinese cultural capabilities that are then launched into this self-propelling form when they are adopted in the West and return to China, and therefore in an alien form as Morse code and telegraphic communication first of all, and then obviously all the other kinds of binary electronic codes. So I think what you get out of that is a sense that this large-scale structural pattern of modernity, where you have first of all this half century of sort of seemingly unstoppable Occidental global surge, and then only in the late phase of the 20th century, during the computer revolution, you then get this extremely stunning rise of the East that everyone has become used to, and which has now become basically almost coincidental with our notion of what globalization means. That that whole historical structure can be read in terms of in terms of digitizable language, and so that's what a Qwernomic materialist reading of modern history would focus upon. Okay, my final point, and this is the most tangled and tortured, and I'm only really wanting to raise it as a kind of an introduction to stuff that I think we mostly be attending to much later, mostly even perhaps in the second module of the course. And this is back to this strata-analysis question. And I think my guiding question for this is, why are we, what's so special about QWERTY? Let's just say we agreed that QWERTY was a platform and was a sort of interesting, was an interesting model of a platform, and does all the kind of things that are tied up with that. And we even then make the second turn and we say that mechanical writing is some kind of key to an understanding of the history of modernity. I think even those two things don't really quite pin down why QWERTY becomes a kind of object of special obsessive attention. And I think the reason that you take another through a certain loop, it takes on a more intense, compelling characteristic is by asking, what is the relationship of QWERTY to strato-analysis? And by talking about strato-analysis, I'm obviously making a reference to this geology of morals essay that I hope is kind of haunting the course, and I hope we will get to look at in some kind of detail. And I think we've already seen there's one set of kind of cascading relations that goes, QWERTY is obviously some kind of platform. Strato-analysis is obviously some kind of philosophical toolkit for discussing platforms, and therefore we have a set of relations of that kind that can be firmed up, but promise to be quite solid, I think, from the start. But I think the twist occurs when you say, well, is it not also the case? This sounds more modest than I think the thesis probably sounds as if it can support. That QWERTY, the QWERTY keyboard, is itself a map or diagram of abstract stratification. Put that another way, Deleuze and Guattari in their essay have this, obviously, this fictional or hypostational character called Professor Challenger, who is presenting in a kind of opaque and elliptical way this science of strato-analysis. It's a deliberately kind of mysteriously written text, and it's deliberately made obscure where Professor Challenger is supposed to be getting strato-analysis from. And so my suggestion is that Professor Challenger gets strato-analysis imminently, and imminently meaning that it's already at his fingertips, in the sense that his diagram, his set of his fundamental conceptual resources for the production of strato-analysis are already embedded in the QWERTY keyboard. That the QWERTY keyboard is a kind of stratification diagram, and that the whole of what Deleuze and Guattari are doing in this essay, what Professor Challenger is doing in his lectures, is actually a coded discussion of the QWERTY keyboard. And I won't push into this too much now, because it obviously becomes quite opaque. But let me just say just a little bit about it. That they bringing together a set of discourses in this. One of them is Hjelmslev's linguistics, and from that they take the vocabulary that they use a lot to do with content and expression, and the relation of forms and substances that are rejigged by this relationship. And they think that Hjelmslev is already engaged in an exercise of strato-analysis and is upgrading structuralist ideas sort of inherited from Saussure and his followers in doing that. And they say that substances, forms and substances, correspond in some way. I should quote them exactly, but I don't think I will, because I would have to just do a little bit of hunting around in the text and slow us down. I'll do that later. They correspond in some way to the relationship that to the terms that they've used previously in the previous volume of Capitalism and Schizophrenia, of codes and territories. And they say, and they're wanting to say that the relationship between content and expression, which is the relationship between one stratum and its substratum, that's to say the stratic relation is a relationship between content and expression, isn't a relationship between forms and substances, because both strata in that system are themselves both formed or consist of formed substances. That's to say forms and substances are apply to both of the strata involved in the content expression relationship. So if you're talking about languages and the conversion from Saussure to Hjelmslev's, from Saussure's linguistics to structural linguistics to Hjelmslev's structural linguistics, the key point that they want to make is the implicit proposition of Saussurean linguistics is that the distinction between the signifier and the signified can be mapped onto the distinction between form and substance. And that Hjelmslev upgrades that by saying, no, that isn't at all the case, that the relationship that is being approached by Saussure's distinction between the signifier and the signified is a structural relationship, a stratic relationship rather, between a stratum of content and a stratum of expression, and both content and expression it consists of formed substances, forms and substances. And that's to say it consists, they think you can translate it across, it consists of elements that are both coded and territorialized. And so I just want to say that, a key board, it seems to me, is exactly the model for this relationship between code and territory, form and substance. That every key has a position, it has a territory, and it has a code, which is obviously the character or instruction or it's actually what is coded onto the keys when you look at your keyboard is, as you would expect from the complexity of their essay. But if you're looking at the central keys, they have a character, an alphanumeric character, and a position keyboard. So there's a relationship. There's an intrinsic duality of form and substance, code and territory on each key. And insofar, therefore, as the keyboard is a diagram of a stratic relation, it comes in layers, as they say. Their very first definition in this essay is to say strata are layers, belts, or in Bratton's language, they're stacks. And this is obviously what again, you're immediately seeing when you're seeing a keyboard. It's a stack. It consists of weirdly 6 layers, basically speaking. And I thought I didn't push Ben Bratton on this because I just thought it would get too weird too fast. But his stack also has 6 layers, and he said, I'm hoping there's some video of this because I certainly enjoyed the conversation. I thought it was very interesting. But he says, there's nothing magical about the number 6. He says, you know, I was hoping there would be 7 layers. You know, if someone else can find another layer for me, then that's totally fine. But there just happen to be 6 layers in Ben Bratton's stack. There are 6 rows, 6 of these belts or layers on the keyboard layout. You know, so it's a stack diagram. It's an intrinsic stack diagram. Whether or not you can trust it or not to tell you anything interesting is obviously another question. But just on that level, it is. And each of the elements in those layers is both coded and territorialized. It's both got a position and it's got a code. So to wrap up this, provisionally wrap up this little diversion, I just want to say that this is why I think QWERTY is special, because it doesn't remain on the side of the object. It's not that you've got a theory of platforms on one hand, and then you look through your whole archive of platforms and you say, oh, look, the QWERTY, that's also a platform. You know, the theory of platforms is not transcendent in relation to QWERTY. If you take this, admittedly, at the moment, precarious step. On the contrary, your general diagram or general theoretical matrix for platforms or strata or stacks in general draws upon the immanent diagrammatic resources at your fingertips of the keyboard. The keyboard is transcendental in relation to the conceptuality of the platform. It's not merely one among any other number of potential empirical objects that you can apply your platform theory to. So anyway, I think I'm going to stop my monologue ramble phase of this and open it up, and any of these zones of consideration or others that are pressing on people are open game for us to discuss.
Before you finish this, what are the six strata of a key?
I'm saying that the keys themselves are arranged in six
right.
layers. You know, you have your layer of, as they actually say, the top layer consists of just these abstract functions. Then you have the numeral row, then you have 3 layers of letters, and then you have your layer which has the space bar and this other series of functions on it.
Cool.
So, I mean, if I was pushing Ben Brad on this, which of course I didn't, because I wouldn't, even though it would be hard to drag me out of Shanghai and subject me to psychiatric incarceration, at least that would be the concern if I was to say to him, isn't your model of the stack actually a particular elaboration of what you have right now at your fingertips in your keyboard interface, that according to a unexamined semiotic fatality has presented you with this stack diagram that you are using to type on at this very moment. But we can backtrack from this particular. I'm going to kind of try and nudge us back into this zone eventually. But if this seems just too gone to be our point of departure, I will this week I will fully understand that, of course.
I mean, I think everyone is probably still digesting the 6 stacks on the keyboard bit, but just like, if we do back out of it just before we do, what do you think the significance of the sort of turn that happens on the right with the repetition of the numerals and sort of a different way of using the keyboard that comes into play there that's sort of specifically meant for, I mean, I gather for like, you know, secretary, accountant, stuff like that. Is there anything?
Well, actually, I mean, maybe we can go through this at some point, you know, step by step, but I think that they have bizarrely a whole range of conceptual vocabulary that would work extremely well if you were just looking for a set of abstract conceptual terms for describing the geographical regions of the keyboard. And their name that I think they apply to this other zone, being, which includes the numeric keypad, is epistrata. You know, what are epistrata? Well, I think that when you're saying, well, what are epistrata, we have an actual diagrammatic model of epistrata right here on the right-hand side of the keyboard. No, that's okay. That's just a word. That's not necessarily very helpful. Yeah, I'm not sure I can say anything particularly helpful about it right now. I have to confess, kind of engrossed in this major part of the keyboard and its structure, and I think it's important what you say. Well, there is this other zone, perhaps. I mean, it's obviously significant. Like, it's completely a-linguistic, isn't it? Except for this set of instructions on it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the sort of secondary functions of end and home and all of that thing kind of aside. I mean, maybe not entirely aside, because you'd still presumably be using the same gestures. But yeah, that interface with like a purely numeric, like, you know, one-handed, is just like, I don't know quite what to make of it. But is epistrata a term that's used in 1,000 Plateaus?
Yes, it's used in this Geology of Morals essay, actually.
Okay.
I mean, there was a certain point of looking at this stuff where at least the question struck me of like, is all of their discussion of the unique culture of the nomad war machine a discussion of what your semiotic practices would be if you were entirely localized on the numeric keypad side of the keyboard? You know, is this little strange block over on the right hand side of the keyboard actually a kind of the culture of the nomad war machine laid out there that just consists entirely of this number system, basically, doesn't it?
That's been sort of integrated into the territory of the keyboard.
Yes,
kind
it's
of
off to the side of it. Yeah, yeah.
Interesting. And I mean, I guess this kind of flows into like another thing I was thinking about with in the first point with this issue of like platforms and whether QWERTY is a platform, and like looking at Bratton's definition, the sort of the qualification or the endpoint of it, where it is about like centralization of its sort of integral adoption through coordination. it's just interesting that like that QWERTY seems to have like that lies in its past. Like it seems as if the explicit network effects could either be considered to be super saturated, like so saturated in such a way that we can't individually identify them. There aren't like specific routes by which they propagate now, because like QWERTY has become, you know, through those network effects happening in the past, has achieved a state of sort of total saturated coordination, pre-coordination or something.
Yes.
Do we still want to call that a platform? It's just like, I don't know, maybe it's just like being too much on the social network idea of platforms or something, like, or the, you know, pretty modern one, but it just seems as if that once it becomes totalized in this way, there's something about like the sense of a living contingent has competitors kind of platform that disappears. And which is an interesting comparison to the blockchain too, as something that kind of starts from that point of like the disappearance of a contingent outside. I don't know if that resonates
I think
to the definition of platform.
Because again, if you sort of step back a little bit, obviously part of what's going on in the Ben Braden book is he's saying we have to sort of rethink our fundamental ideas about geopolitics through this platform and stack model of these systems. You know, what he calls stack sovereignty, platform sovereignty, sorry. And obviously what you're saying is, well, there's something about QWERTY that obviously interlocks with that discussion, but also seems to overflow it, doesn't it, in a certain direction? Like,
yeah, exactly.
It sort of, it subverts resistance by its kind of extreme globalization, and the fact that it seems to have just preemptively subverted the any kind of leverage or resistance by saturation.
That we have to substantiate this lock-in argument by going for like the one other layout that anyone has ever even tried to use, and that is still like adopted by like a tiny fraction. I mean, forget Windows. Like that's a kind of like unprecedented. It's hard to, other than like maybe the Arabic numerals or the Indian numerals themselves, it's hard to think of anything else that.
Yes, it is, and I think it's interesting to think, like, obviously, if I can just kind of zoom down to this sort of super concrete level about the kind of global geopolitical traumas that everyone is undergoing at the moment. This is obviously articulated, the common public discussion of that is that it's some kind of revolt against globalization that is happening, isn't it? I mean, that's the kind of the basic narrative. And so, you know, we could say, well, so how does that relate to this topic? Because obviously we're looking here, you know, this QWERTY question it's a model of this absolutely extreme instantiation of globalization, isn't it? It's like a kind of high water mark of it. And whatever we say about the Chinese typewriter, I mean, it's still the case that QWERTY has pushed itself really deeply into China. I mean, the electronic shops here are still all selling QWERTY keyboards, and it's not as if China somehow, whatever is now going on in terms of these kind of Malahani questions, China did not have some barrier against this. So QWERTY has really globalized itself as nothing else has, as you say, other than perhaps, well, I think, I shouldn't qualify it, other than the decimal numerals.
And is it sort of wrong to have an impression that a lot of that globalization of the Indian numerals is pretty much contemporaneous and sort of entangled with the globalization of QWERTY? Like, I can't imagine that like there was just universal use of like those numerals in China, for example, like prior to, like, or much prior to the simultaneous spread of like of typewriting and of,
yes,
you know.
That's a really interesting question. It's a really interesting question because I think that there's a temptation to do two completely contradictory things here, and both of them have something to them, I think. One is that the Hindu-Arab numerals obviously are actually so catalytic, so primordially catalytic of modernity, that you have to put them like right at the start, you know. And there's no sense of what the Renaissance is, what the kind of genesis of modernity is, that doesn't already involve the arrival of the decimal numerals. But then there's the other thing, and I think you're totally right about this, like what sort of completed the globalization of the decimal numerals clearly was their instantiation in these technical products that were then, you know, as commodities distributed around the world. And I think one of them that is totally crucial is just the calculator, you know, before the computer, the calculator, where, I mean, I had an experience this is totally anecdotal, but I thought there was something kind of archetypal about it, where I was in some Southeast Asian country, honestly, I can't remember where, and there was a absolute language barrier, because I was in some little market where people were not English speaking, and I can't even remember, maybe it was Thailand or somewhere with a language of which I have absolute zero competence. And yet you could engage in completely comfortable, articulate commercial transactions, because they were used to people, foreigners flowing through, and every shopkeeper, every little stall holder had a electronic calculator. And they didn't use these calculators as calculating machines. They used them as communication devices. Because, you know, if they had to say, you know, how much is this, they just type it in and show you on the calculator the decimal numerals for the price of this particular product.
Yeah, fantastic.
So, you know, I think there's something really important going on there.
Numbering characters or number words. Yeah. Yes,
I mean, certainly if you want to call it a word, but for sure it's numerical communication via this particular cheap technical device.
Yeah, no, I didn't mean to call that a word. I meant sort of in contrast to their number words, because of a lack of like verbal number
yes,
word.
or signs. I mean, China actually has an old traditional set of number signs, but also has fully adopted the kind of Hindu-Arab decimal numerals. So they both run in parallel. It's not that they've abandoned their old ones, but absolutely everyone is conversant with both of those systems. And I think China is the utter outlier in this, in the sense that if anyone was not going to have been globalized into this semiotic regime, it would be them, you know.
Right.
And
did you see what Adam was saying, that Baidu has like been able to cut that out, cut the pinyin middleman out, and is like directly recognizing or doing like mappings from speech to character? I thought that was pretty interesting.
Yes, that's total Malahani's own stuff for sure, isn't it?
Yeah, I think I missed that reading, unfortunately. But I thought it was just like what immediate is that it works a lot like facial recognition. You know, you've got like a sort of set of like unique records, and you're doing like visual matching on the basis of sound features, I guess. And
yes,
I don't know, it just reminded me of what is it called? The way of like of interfacing with data as like facial expressions. Remember from yeah, I don't know, just as an alternative.
It was from you, Jake, that there was that incredible video of the lip reading computer software, wasn't there? Remember that? Was that from you?
Yeah.
I mean, which is just staggering. I mean, that's another example. That it has a reliability way exceeding human competence. And obviously, so this general sphere of translation software is something that's just racing ahead so fast now that it's just incredible. But if you go back to this stacks and platforms idea, there's obviously is this set of strata here, where at the base level of the strata, or yeah, I'm sure that you're not going to push it below this, you have a kind of digital numerical system that then in this set of software stacks goes through to these high level translation competences. So there's a complete kind of globalization of a certain set of numerical protocols that then allow these local semiotics to survive, you know, and China can keep its undigitizable characters precisely because the the infrastructure has gone over onto these digital machines.
Right, it's
so
just like it sort of sinks down to a more base stratum, and it's interesting, it becomes purely numeral in the process of doing so. You lose the alphabetic numeral distinction once you go below the level of the alphabetic keyboard, and that digitalization sinks into the level of pure number, which is pretty cool.
Yeah.
I don't mean to like just completely monopolize, like.
No, it's great. It's totally on the spot. Yeah. Sorry, what I'm totally losing. What's the meaning of 7735 cell? I'm just totally not.
That old calculator trick of, you know, when you're mucking around in maths in primary school and you write words on your calculator.
Oh yeah.
But you have to read it through the alphabet, yeah.
Yes. No, that's critical, isn't it? And it's something that I think someone could put as a counterpart to what we're doing is the mobile phone. This is now really on the side of the numeric keypad, isn't it? Where you have your translation of words into numbers by that strange, I think, totally different semiotic regime. I should probably be more interested in that than I am, but I've always been so much more tangled up with keyboards than I have with mobile phone interfaces that I'm a bit blind to this one.
Yeah, you get some weird stuff there. Like, I mean, I use swipe, for example, where you're, you know, basically tracing out like simplified vector diagrams across the board in order to get words, and
Right.
which is just sort of, but you do it with like your thumb, with like one finger, and so like the whole manual element is sort of maximally abstracted away. And then of course it's like constantly wrong because you're just purely dependent on like the equivalent of autocorrect, and so you get these sort of constant, like sometimes interesting substitutions.
Yes, but what you're saying about autocorrect, I'm sorry to keep bringing this Malahani thing back, which I'm not doing it just to torment you, but his big argument is that this thing about predictive text, which is basically autocorrect, is critical to this, what's now producing this kind of weird Chinese advantage, because of the fact that in the West, because of the fact that the system's laid out to our convenience, you know, you type out all the characters you want, but because their characters are not on the keyboard, instead you get to them through these predictive text routes, these peculiar vectors that actually allow software to work for you to produce your text in a way that he's saying in the Occident is blocked by our sheer success. You know, there's no, we don't get that economization through predictive text because the keys just are our letters, and so we don't need to get to them by this software mediated route. Yeah,
which, I mean, I haven't, when I do get the chance to actually read this article, I feel like I'm going to have a fair amount of sympathy for it, because like, I mean, this is like especially just feels topical this week, but the way digital, like rapid, like minimally mediated interaction with these digital systems seems to have affected political stability, mimetic stability in general in the Occident, like especially among like, the rising generation and so forth, but like across the board, this like flood of disinformation, even, in excess of the usual that's been going on this week. And just whether like the Chinese having this sort of staggered entry, this fairly base level, but, obviously not utterly numerically base, sort of linguistic semi-barrier, a traumatic experience at the beginning of it, which if you wanted to go in a psychoanalytic direction is, arguably part of the basis of a stable personality, for a territory, quote unquote. If from a stability and sustainability standpoint, if this won't ultimately have been good for China, relative to the Occident, to have this sort of time offset.
Yes, well, that's definitely Malahani's argument. I mean, obviously, Amy's in the sidebar putting objections that I'm very sensitive to. I mean, I'd be interested in what other people think about this, because I sort of hate autocorrect. I mean, I'm always tempted to turn it off. I feel that I'm being bossed around by it in a way that it's just like molarizing in the most annoying possible way. Like, no, I want this goddamn neologism. You know what I mean? I'm not trying to say the thing that's in your vocabulary database.
Yeah, absolutely.
But at the same time, I get Malahani's point, that it's the fact that you're deliberately refusing to allow software to cooperate with your writing process because well, it's there already, in the keyboard, and it comes as a kind of aggression against you almost. Whereas I think in the Chinese case, it is genuinely helpful that you want to. The point is, you want to. Okay, let me say this slightly different way. I think as a Westerner, it might be that there are people who try to go with the flow of autocorrect, and say, how can I make this work for me, and how can I learn how it thinks, how does it work, and become, get into the zen of autocorrect so it does what you want, rather than it constantly and annoyingly and unpredictably doing stuff that you hadn't expected and is going against your sort of I'll be crude about it, your intentions. And I think because of the fact that the Chinese character just isn't going to come to you except by this kind of route, that you get cultured into this cooperative relation with this predictive text machinery that you've just not cultured into in a Western context.
Is there kind of like an analogy between the way, like thinking about this idea that we have a cultural system that becomes embedded in the technology, so it predicts the most likely next word in your phrase based on, I don't know how it's calculated. Adam was saying that it sometimes is calculated through other means, but the general pool of possible next phrases, which kind of leads it down to I don't know, a mainstream consensus.
Yeah.
In the way that, so you get this kind of the cultural is embedded in the technological, which then feeds back into the cultural and sort of standardizes it even more, or fortifies its particular molarities, to use that phrase.
Yeah.
In the way that, so you get like finger counting is where digitization comes from. The alphabet then can be sort of seen as something that's built on top of digitization in all these alphanumeric uses of the alphanumeric languages, which then, eventually, fast forward a millennium, becomes a QWERTY keyboard, and then feeds back into those very hands that built the decimal system in the first place. And I mean, we all have like the QWERTY pattern kind of ingrained in however we type. And when you notice that when you try and type on a French or an Italian or a German keyboard. So it's the same kind of like feedback back into the cultural world, the material in this particular.
Yes, I think there's a lot going on in that. I think there's a lot going on in that. I mean, one of them is obviously this is a kind of system of stratification, isn't it? Like the system of stratification, they say, produces molar aggregates. And so, you know, these, if we're going back to the start of what you're saying to do with this predictive text system, it just as the first, at the beginning of the era of type, dictionaries standardized spelling. So there is this kind of standardization, molarization of language that is now coming in with this, with autocorrect, where it's telling you what it thinks that you want to say based on exactly as you say, that it's the standard molar thing that would be said from a particular position. And so part of that is that autocorrect is actually, I mean, it almost just is linguistics. It's like it's you know, well, the same, again, at least analogous to the role of the dictionary in sort of the construction of a sense of what is language. Autocorrect actually requires this, you know, it can't work unless it is an actually incarnated linguistic analysis, that these are typical patterns. This is what your language actually is like. You might not consciously know, or you almost certainly don't, you know, how if you write a particular set of characters, it would standardly unfold, but the software knows more than you do about the actual kind of standard pattern of your own language. So I definitely think there's in all the ambivalence of what it's meant by stratification, there's a process of stratification going on in this particular wave of linguistic software, for sure. I'm chopping out a whole bunch of what you said in terms of also this kind of techno-neurological loop that reinstalls the keyboard in your brain.
Well, I mean, it's interesting
Yeah.
because at least in the predictive text example, it's kind of culture that's the agent, the primary agent. But maybe with QWERTY, you could see it in a different, like, or sort of poised on an inversion of that agency, where instead of the cultural informing the technical, fortifying the cultural. So you get a kind of concretization ultimately of the cultural, and a sort of elimination of possible other trajectories if it went the other way. So the technical kind of takes on an agency of its own, and then is reformatting the cultural towards a different kind of articulation of material possibilities that's not connected to cultural agency, or to at least kind of like levers it out of its ingrained pattern. I mean, there's a different
because QWERTY, obviously, whatever you say about it in terms of its origin, which is very mysterious, it's not a systematization of already existing linguistic propensities in the same way that these autocorrect systems are, even remotely, is it? It's in some sense just irreducibly alien code that is being introduced into the culture.
Yeah, I mean, we haven't kind of like approached this yet, but I was thinking of this in relation to the alpha question, alphabet, which can be distilled from the QWERTY arrangement and gives you that other code, which comes out of, it's sort of like a cultural trajectory that's hidden in the technological concretization of the cultural. Well, yeah, I mean, it depends where you want to say your decimal system came from, but maybe we should talk about that later.
Yeah, I think it might be a little bit early to introduce alpha coercion at this point. That would be my guess.
I think in the sense of just sort of following on this cascade that you're describing, Amy, I was reading about subitization the other day, just sort of following on from starting the universal history of numbers in this issue of like, can any human beings naturally perceive groupings greater than 4 as such, like perceive 5s directly at a glance? and that so naturally it only goes up to 4, but specifically if we, through the use of dice, most adults can recognize 5s and 6s at a single glance, purely through that sort of like technical remediation, which adds to the set of percepts that we have, which are sort of pure percepts of number. And it's just sort of interesting to imagine that, like, you know, do my fingers know the shape of the word nap or the word apple or something like that? And does that sort of, is that a form of subitization? Like, even if it's, you know, diagrammatic and sort of manually remembered rather than all of these things that we associate with sort of numerical visual recognition. I don't know if those are sort of similar techno-neurological processes.
I think I might.
Sorry, I didn't have any.
No. It's an engrossing point, but I might need a little bit more help with this. So, yeah, because I saw your subitization tweets, and I think I get the point of this. You catch some glimpse, not even a whole glimpse of some part of a die face. And you see the whole number that you're not in fact seeing. You know that the fraction you are seeing is
specifically
because
prompt,
isn't it?
Say that again.
Yeah, it's a prompt. It's like a kind of a
and a sort of a medium for both a medium and a motive for recognition of these being trained, or like your sort of your numerical percept set expanding, because like part of the point is like, so is that naturally we don't go above 4. There's like a very specific sort of cutoff, which is why we get like in the Roman tally system, it changes from marks at 5, and he had a couple of other like good examples of where the 4 to 5 transition.
Well, 4 actually, this is interesting because 4 seems too far. I mean, both in the Roman system and in the Chinese numbers 1, 2, and 3 are like the Roman ones, but on their side. There's a stack actually. So 1 is just a horizontal line, 2 is 2 horizontal lines, 3 is 3 horizontal lines, and then 4 is a distinctive character. And obviously with the Roman system, 2, 4 is 5 minus 1, isn't it? You suddenly change your semiotic procedure in the transition from 3 to 4, not the transition from 4 to 5.
I think that he says that at some point. He's like, and some people can see 4s, and you know, he goes through like the 1 too many and the like 2 and 2 and all of that sort of thing. I'm just trying to find the spot where sort of he adduces a good like 2 or 3 examples of where like at least for some symbolic representations that 4 seems to be the maximum. It wasn't just the Roman tallies. Might have to come back to that specific thing later. But yeah, I mean, this just the fact that through the use of dice and that, again, like that motive and medium that they give us, we are able to expand that set of things that we naturally subitize. Or I don't know if they call it, like if the base level, the 3 and 4 is still referred to as subitization or not. But I don't know, the fact that expansion or that transition is made possible through remediating it through dice. And I guess just that comparing it to the way the shapes with which words map to the keyboard as typed out is also contingent, adds to a contingent vocabulary of percepts that some part of our brains is like repeatedly recognizing, as trained itself to add to sort of a set of natural forms that it knows, whether those two things are comparable. We're kind of, sort of running at a tangent here.
No, but it's interesting. It's complicated to me because the representation numbers on dice is itself weird, isn't it? And it is like what we see with both the Roman and Chinese systems up to 3. You know, like it's like you say, it's a tallying system. So 1 is 1 line, 2 is 2 lines, 3 is 3 lines. With the dice, 1 is 1 dot, 2 is 2 dots, 3 is 3 dots. And so it's like it's not a symbolic number system. I mean, in some ways, it's an extremely different semiotic regime to that. For instance, the Hindu-Arab numerals, or then if you get into more arcane questions about the numerical values of letters, the same, that they have a symbolic value. And so, for instance, it's the difference between the number of letters in a word, which is like the number of dots on a dice, isn't it? On a die.
Mm-hmm.
So it's the difference between tallying and symbolic calculation. So I'm just trying to wonder, how you move this subitization stuff out of tallying, out of semiotic regimes based on tallying. Is there a translation to other semiotic regimes, or is it something that is tied up very much with tallying?
I think it corresponds to just pictures, because that's sort of the example, or that seems relevant to me, with the dice, each face being two-dimensional, and of that promoting blocking groups of dots together rather than tallying them linearly, and so forth. But if you look at it like a picture of 5 antelope versus 7 antelope versus 3, there's a processing difference. You're able to immediately see and say that is 3 antelope, but if it's 7, you got to at least in a split second, you have to split it up and count,
right,
and then add together.
Yeah.
But that through this promotion of blocking into groups, and then just sort of repeated, motivated, having to recognize these things on the spot, or we find that we expand the number of things that is able to be spot recognized like that. And just because it's distributed, so they're very simple diagrams, but they're always, well, they're not always square surfaces. I mean, those are modern dice, I think post-Roman dice, right? But you used to have things that you rolled that were cylindrical and so forth, but still used, I think, every face. Maybe that they were more linear in those cases, I'm not sure, but just that turning the numbers into diagrams that are recognized on the spot, as soon as you perceive them, and that sort of turning into a finite grammar. I mean, obviously, QWERTY is not directly mappable. It's much more sophisticated, because you have this arbitrary generativity of language mapped in versus a discrete finite set of 6. I just think in terms of the brain being trained to,
yes,
one of these geometrized, geometrized numerical systems that involve sort of spot recognition or translation into something spatial, something semiotic.
I mean, this obviously does connect with Amy's point about the kind of neurological reabsorption of the keyboard, doesn't it?
Right. Yeah, exactly.
It's complicated because of the fact that the keyboard is such a preposterously complicated system. I mean, even though on one level it's very finite, it's if you compare it with the kind of diagrams modeled by a face of a die, it's just bizarrely complicated. How many particular semiotic elements and territorial positions that you have in a kind of standard standard keyboard is huge. So I don't know. It's there's just that simple.
Really directly intensively compare them more than just. It seemed like a really earlier basic example of something that ultimately we see in QWERTY.
Yeah.
This technical remediation of recognition of the basic semiotic elements. But yeah, no, I didn't have anywhere to go. I think that makes a lot of sense. I don't have anywhere to go from there.
Does anyone have anything to say about this Azerty thing? I mean, it is a remarkable phenomenon. I mean, the fact, as Wan Yong's just said, that Korean people, I mean, I guess, you know, the geopolitics of that is all very interesting, and you can put together kind of plausible narratives about it quite quickly. But, you know, is Azerty a kind of a spontaneous, pre-conscious, pre-intentional French revolt against Anglophone globalization?
It's not, yeah, I see what you're getting at. I mean, the French don't like a standardization model that doesn't privilege their particular version of events. Like the standardization of Greenwich Mean Time was something that they resisted. And my partner's father, he's French, he still refers to it as Paris Mean Time in 2016.
Yeah, no, it's been a fascinating process, that.
But it's not just the French. Like the Germans have a QWERTY keyboard, and Italy has QWERTY. So there are still these kind of regional differences as well.
Are they like widely used, or?
I'm not sure. Does anyone use a QWERTY or a QWERTY keyboard? I don't know. But yeah, I mean, it's interesting, this particular sort of cultural resistance connected to a particular French idea of patrimony, or
well, I mean, it's a hugely sort of significant model of kind of anti-globalization, or resistance, like you say, to globalization. I mean, you think about what's involved in, I mean, all the industrial structures producing keyboards need to be localized. You know, like it's just on that sort of simple level of techno-economic friction. It's extraordinary, isn't it? Surely, you know, you can't just stick a standard keyboard in some crate in wherever it's produced now, Shenzhen or somewhere, and send it to France. If people want an Azerty keyboard, there has to be a whole other production and supply chain and all of this, and the same for all these others. So it's like, it is quite remarkable like that. And so
you can turn it.
Yeah.
Sorry.
No.
I mean, you can turn it back though, and look at, I mean, like the American recalcitrance against adopting the decimal measurement system. Like, I don't know, we have a kind of problem in Australia where we can't employ, or there's a kind of problem employing American laborers, because when they get onto building sites and start doing their measurements, they kind of lapse back into the duodecimal system.
No, it is hugely interesting, that it's true. And I don't know, obviously it is related by this question about globalization, standardization, and conventions.
It's kind of a question of like, where do you locate your abstract substrate? Where is it? And these like pockets of resistance are, I guess, correctly identified as resistance to globalization.
I mean, but
connected to identity.
It's not like, I obviously think the comparison is totally right, but it does seem to me there's a kind of asymmetry in the sense that, however sort of on some level bizarre the American attachment to imperial measurement systems is, because of their particular position in the global trading system, it doesn't strike me as being a form of resistance in the same way that these other systems are. It seems more like a form of like absolutely you know, complacent hegemonic sort of, you know, I'm not trying to moralize the whole thing, but it's not as if this is, oh, maybe I can't, I'm not, this is kind of relapsing into a form of extremely unsatisfactory intuition to me. So, okay, because I totally see the connection of this, but sheer scale and power of the American market means that this kind of imperial measurement system isn't subject to just kind of stress, is it? In the same way, like it's not as if there's any suggestion that they're sort of making a sacrifice to defend the local culture from this kind of globalizing force. It's more that they just haven't, because their position is so super secure, that they just aren't under any pressure to change it. I mean, sorry, this is like now I'm wandering off a bit.
But that's kind of the question I was asking. I don't know if that, like, there isn't an answer, but like whoever has market predominance gets to determine, well, I mean, not that they're determining it intentionally, but the abstract substrata of calculation that they have absorbed in their history becomes the dominant abstract substrata, because of market dynamics. So the market puts the abstract in place, and then tries to export it to everyone else.
There has to be a complication to that, to the extent that, you know, if it were the case that there was just no question of competitive pressure on these substrates, then for sure that would be true, and it would be completely arbitrary question of path dependency. And that's what the critical people in the sort of Qwernomics camp are wanting to say about QWERTY. But insofar as there's any sort of differential competitive competence of these different substrates, then you'd at least think at the margin that there would be a tendency to push it one way or another, wouldn't you? I mean, it's like, it's not arbitrary in the sense that some just simply, well, QWERTY is a complicated example, but for instance, this decimal thing, I mean, it's just okay, I'm gonna hate myself for saying this, but I mean, the French do have a point on a lot of the decimalization issue, that it's just like, of course makes more sense where it can be conveniently and practically done to push things in the direction of a decimal system. It just kind of simplifies calculation. There's a whole bunch of kind of semiotic economies that come in to it, and just engaging in a kind of any kind of mathematical calculative practice where you're involving with a whole set of incommensurable numerical modules and converting between feet and inches and as you know, base modulus 12 to modulus 10 and modulus 60 time units, and it can't be that that's purely arbitrary, because it's just clearly massively inconvenient, and you wouldn't start from there if you were doing it again. Whereas the QWERTY case is much more difficult, because I don't think we can be confident that we wouldn't start from there if we were starting over. You know, there's no argument that we wouldn't, but I don't think it carries through with vast force. Yeah. I don't know. There's lots of weird directions this can go in. I mean, obviously, I think this whole Sumerian sexagesimal question is really interesting. But I can't help feeling maybe it's a little bit of a digression.
If no one's gonna jump on that, I'm just gonna mention something weird that happened to me the other week. I was talking to Jake about this, but you mentioned, we were talking about this kind of on Twitter. Yeah, you mentioned the speculative hypothesis of IFRA on where the sexagesimal system came from.
Right.
And I went to look it up in my copy of the Universal History of Numbers, which is secondhand, and I hadn't gotten up to that bit. But I don't think I had. And when I opened it up, it had been bookmarked already, presumably by the previous owner of the book, that one page. And it completely freaked me out.
Right. Oh, good.
And that's all I'm going to say. Someone else.
Yeah. I mean, there's a very arcane route, as again something that's been done on Twitter about sexagesimal, the Sumero-Babylonian system and decimal, because of the fact that, you know, if you fold the decimal numerals together into pairs, so you've got 54, 63, 72, 81, 90, that adds up to 360. So it's completely decimal in the sense you're not introducing anything else at all, and yet you get this you get this Sumero-Babylonian numerical structure out of it. But as I say, I think that's at least peripheral to the core concerns of Qwernomics, probably.
It sounds kind of like Anders territory to me.
Yes, I think it is. It is. Anders territory.
It definitely reminds me of your comment. I think it was in Calendric Dominion, of just like the sheer horror of the fact that the year doesn't add up to 360. That all of these things work, and that not only does it not add up to 360, this chronogeometry breaks at the sort of in the final margin, but also doesn't, that none of these natural quantities form for, you know, I guess like real number relationships.
Yeah.
I don't know. You can definitely feel that nostalgia, that desire for the chronometric ideal, like,
yeah,
and the horror.
Totally, totally
strong.
No, I keep always sort of forgetting that it's supposed to be the year, of course, and people tried so hard to make it the year.
Oh yeah, wars over it. I remember I did a course in intertestamental Judaism at one point, and just like the number of like physically violent schisms between communities that happened over this question of the solar, the lunar, the hybrid, you know, and it had to match up to the holidays in the same way year after year, and then sort of the introduction of jubilees and like just all of these things. Like, yeah, it was just a gigantic cultural, psychocultural struggle over this incompatibility.
Yeah. I mean, the year is not constant, is it? It's that Earth's rotation is slowing down. So if there's a date eventually that will hit any of these smaller years. At some point in the future, they will there'll be a year that matches what you're looking for, but
Right, absolutely. And for any,
impractically distant.
I wonder if you could somehow construct one with days that would never be hit mathematically, if that would work. Huh. Sorry, tangent. I have to spend a long time trying to figure that out.
I mean, if it was too long, you've got no problem, I think.
Oh, right. That makes sense.
To shoot this off in a different, less arcane direction.
Yeah.
Maybe bring some other people in. Something I was thinking about reading through some of Bratton's stuff in relation to the article, the Milani article. Bratton writes some really great stuff about the user layer in relation to what is defined as the user. I think he says something really great, like it's only a pattern of, a user can only be identified in relation to its pattern of interaction with the interface or something like that. A user is just a pattern. It doesn't have any ontological content. He has a great quote about masks or something like, the position of the user maps only very incompletely onto any one individual body from the perspective of the platform, the user platform. What looks like one is really many, and what looks like many may only be one. And he kind of talks about, you know, trying to define a subjectivity for the user. Is it an IP address? Is it a kind of conglomeration of human and non-human entities and their proxies, sensors, whatever? And sort of talks about this strange effect where as soon as you start as a human user interacting with stuff like the quantified self movement, these health apps, you get this kind of overwhelming individuation, this concretization and continuity of your identity through the data, which then is multiplied and de-differentiated because you suddenly see how the outside space, the material space that you're interacting with, is determining you, and you become replaced by this sort of fluid, multiple fractured identity. And so human use of the user platform inevitably kind of splinters. And I was thinking about my kind of feeling when I was reading the Milani article is that there's, he kind of talks about how the Chinese typing system is kind of dominating now because of the levels of mediation that happen between the input and then the kind of processing of the code to get back the particular character that's produced. And I feel like there's a kind of argument you can make that there's a sort of ontological openness in the East to fluidity, which you then have to build a concrete individuation on top of. And it's sort of the reverse in the West. You always start from the position of the individual and then you try and push it into the flows. So there's this inversion of like kind of ontological concreteness and ontological fluidity, and that this kind of Chinese ease with mediation comes out of a sort of spontaneous cultural ontological presupposition about the individual user, that it's fine to have all these levels of mediation and this kind of splintering effect. Whereas in the West, it comes as a kind of trauma. And so the way that the stack, as Bratton kind of puts it, seems to be going is towards this more mediated, more Eastern model.
Right.
And I just thought it was interesting thinking about what becomes individuated as, like what identity, what sort of anthropomorphic identity becomes in relation to these particular technological systems. But just throwing that out there.
No, I think that's good for sure. It maybe is to shift your vocabulary a little bit, but or across it in a certain way. But there's this whole question about masks. I mean, obviously, the cliche. It's kind of Orientalist in a way that I don't really have much problem with, but maybe people do. But this whole question of face, you know, which is such a giant Chinese notion. And it basically means the same as originally, obviously, person means mask, so the personal classically in archaic Western culture is the same as face in contemporary Chinese culture, and it is the pattern of interface behavior without grave ontological anxiety about the relation of that to some deep individual. You sort of maintain your face, you maintain your person, you maintain your mask, you maintain your avatar. And so I think there is this, I sort of agree a lot that in the contemporary West, it's partly to do with sort of notions of authenticity, isn't it? That, I mean, the tendencies to deride these notions of face, to see it as kind of somehow inauthentic, that you shouldn't be so concerned about face, but you should be concerned as of expressing some authentic, real thing. And it's the same as that has been the migration of the notion of the person, from person just being a mask to now when you talk about something being personal, you mean the exact opposite of that. You mean, the thing that is somehow not the mask, not just the kind of management protocol, but that which is being served, that the internet interface management protocol is serving. So yeah. And obviously it can be, you could run it through the whole avatar language, I guess, just the same.
I feel like it's more traumatic for the West, though, to have to kind of come to terms with this idea of the self as a mask. Maybe that's just random speculation.
Yes, but I think it seems very plausible to me too. I think it's got a lot to do with this whole notion of spiritual interiority that's such a big part of the Western religious tradition, isn't it? So that, that it's a matter of just cosmic religious importance, what the authentic spiritual personal content of some process is, like the state of one's soul, which I think is really different in the East. I think if your face is good, then things are fine. I think that there's much less anxiety, deep ontological anxiety about personhood. Oh yeah, that's interesting. Adam's thing about Mien, yeah.
Right.
How old is the Western sense of that?
I looked it up. It goes through French to Old French into basically beyond the mists of time.
Right. So it's really archaic in the West too.
Yeah, it only survives as an archaism, but it's at least recognizable archaism.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, that is interesting. It's weird, actually, isn't it? Because obviously the Ma thing, I have no problem with at all, in the sense that it seems to me, it doesn't surprise me that there are these kind of certain primordial linguistic phonemic elements that are just pre-conventional. But it's very hard to say. There's something almost unbelievably like twisted and paradoxical about Mien, which is the absolute opposite of what would be meant, isn't it, by a primordial pre-convention. It's all about convention. It's all about surface. It's all about the non-primordial in a way. That it should then have this weird consistency is extraordinary. Yeah, really strange.
Right, and there's so few, there's so little shared vocab actually between Chinese and English even today. Like there's loan words going back and forth in very modern loan words, but there's actually not a lot of shared ones otherwise. So yeah. Anyway, it's you know it may be. It's just interesting. I don't know that I can put much scholarly weight behind it, but yeah. The user thing, I do really like the the role of the user in Bratton's sort of layout, his stack model. And the stuff that exactly the sort of stuff that Amy's bringing up, and then Bratton. I was on the session that you mentioned, and I think you picked up on this too. So he's always talking about reversibility. So as soon as you have an interface, okay, there's a couple of points here. So is the keyboard the whole platform? You know, maybe that's not the right way to think of it. At least you could say that, you could not say that. But if you use Bratton's model specifically, I think you would say it's the interface layer.
Right.
Into another part of the platform, right? And then you're the user on the side of it. And then whenever you have an interface, it's reversible. So, and Jake had this great paper about baby names being influenced by QWERTY, which he dropped in one of these previous sessions, where more baby names are being chosen that use letters from the right side of the keyboard. You have this, because the dominant hand is associated with certain positive sort of associations psychologically.
Right.
And so that's this very clear example of the reversibility of that interface and the sort of QWERTY interface programming its users in a certain way. The other really interesting, or the other thing that Bratton emphasizes about users is he's constantly saying they're not necessarily humans. Not only can you be several in the fact that you face all different platforms as different users, but the users facing platforms don't have to be human. They could be, animals. They can be self-driving cars. They can be sensors that are, spread throughout the city, et cetera, et cetera. It's a position rather than a person. It's not a person.
Right. Yes. Or it's a person only in the archaic sense of person, where it's exactly a person, but in a modern sense, no. Yes. Yeah. I mean, obviously, it's probably a bit inane to bring this in, but it's impossible for me not to immediately make Turing test connections with this. Just even in the most colloquial sense like that, the spam filter thing about prove you're not a robot, where all it has to go on is your intersection with the interface, isn't it? And the fact it therefore has to ask you, has to test you, is confirmation of this thing that it's lost all of the sort of criteria for ontological differentiation that you would get outside of the interface zone.
This is anecdotage, but I'm sure there's an article somewhere, I can't remember where I found it, but there was very early days of computer terminals facing stock exchanges, One particular firm got a robot built because they couldn't interface to the terminal in any other way. So they got a robot built to type on the keyboard in order to automate their trading, because that was the best way to get orders in quickly and be responsive. So they could sort of get the read, but they couldn't get the write into the terminal system. It was prior to lockdown, sort of, these exchange terminals still are. But they could put a robot in the user position, literally typing on the keyboard.
How weird. I'm finding it hard to even get my head around this. Like,
well, it wouldn't be a full humanoid robot. It would just be literally something that sat on the
a typing machine. But why would you go through the keyboard, though? I'm not sure.
You could then put a programming interface into the machine that could then transmit the orders by pressing the keystrokes. There's no other way to get the information.
You can't just replace the keyboard with a, you know,
or it was,
I mean, the keyboard is being translated into a set of kind of
protocol
code.
wire. So they went through the keyboard, literally impersonating the human user in the user position.
That's odd. That's really strange.
But it didn't catch on, but it definitely existed. Yeah, picked it. Right, I'll see if I can find one.
Sorry, I mustn't get lost in the sidebar.
Nick, one of the things you touched on with Ben last time was the static nature of the platform. Do you want to talk about that a little bit more?
Well, when you say about static, this question about, because this is where this platform discussion, as I'm sure Ben is very explicitly working on this, quite subtly in some way, but there's obviously a whole set of political economic questions about the platform, because I think you can surely define a platform by the fact that it is a machine for protecting itself against intrusion from users. Like, what makes something a platform is the fact that in using it, you're not rewriting the basic protocol of the platform. Now, I think you can say the same thing about Strata. That's why I think these two discussions are very similar to each other. And it obviously also then spills into a whole set of political economic questions about governance, because the basic relationship that the user has with the platform is one in which they are structurally excluded from the system of governance. I mean, this could be said very critically. I'm not at all suggesting is intrinsically critical. And Ben also was saying he also doesn't see it as being a critical point. But I think conventionally within the Western political tradition, it would be seen as a critical point to make, that that the user is from a certain perspective, radically disempowered because their interaction with the protocol or the platform does not extend in principle to rewriting the basic principles of the platform or the institution or the convention or however we're running this thing. So it's sorry, just to make sure that's the discussion that you're referencing there, Theodore, is that right?
Correct, yeah.
Yeah.
But I mean, it seems also like the platform is also constantly having to need to revise itself as it determines like better ways to function. Or no?
Well, I don't know. I think this is a really complicated and extremely interesting theoretical issue. I mean, look, if you start with where we're at here, obviously the user of a keyboard is not redesigning a keyboard. You know, you could use a keyboard to write a tract, as people have done, about why the QWERTY keyboard should be replaced by a different keyboard, but it's a kind of it's a rigid platform in the sense that there's your use of the platform does not change the structure of the platform, and so it's extremely, you could say, extremely techno-hardened version of this continuum. And I think at the other end of the continuum, there are in a sense, I think, political models where all interaction is in principle accessing the core principles and procedures of the system under consideration. And I sort of think there's a kind of ideal form of that conception that is absolutely central to the mainstream of Western political economic thinking. I think it's the kind of Rousseauistic ideal that social participation is subject to no restraints other than those continuously negotiated in the process of the social process. And I think this is an extreme generality, this question, and there's distinction, there's spectrum. So there's one whole, you could launch a kind of, you could take this whole Qwernomics question and embed it within a kind of Rousseauistic radical democracy critique of technostructure, where this of platforms to be stratic, to distinguish the protocol layer from the user layer would be just being taken as a kind of point of criticism, definitely. And then I think there are currents in the opposite direction, which would take this as a model. Now, in that discussion, we obviously talking about this whole voice exit discussion, you know. So the counterpart to the Rousseauistic model is that by exit and entering platforms, you subject them to selective pressure. which is extremely different in principle to editing pressure. So you don't edit a QWERTY keyboard by using it, but you could migrate to a different keyboard, and therefore you could apply selective pressure to the keyboard as a whole, and that this model can be generalized to political regimes, to involvement in to interaction with businesses. It sort of cuts across the whole political economic space, I think.
I mean, one of Bratton's whole things is platforms are not markets, are not states, right? He spends a lot of time trying to say it's not a market versus state opposition. There's a triadic relationship where you have market, states, and platforms.
Yeah.
And sort of.
I mean, I'm slightly skeptical of that. We didn't get into this.
But I mean, I'd be interested in your take on that part of that, actually.
No, I'm a little bit skeptical. We didn't really have an opportunity to dig into this. I think Ben's point is that if you're talking about governance, you're not talking about a market. And I'm not sure whether that move is persuasive. Like, it's not really that the question of governance is in principle something alien or extrinsic, or is it in conceptual opposition to the principle of commerce, is it? I mean, there are a lot of different ways they can be articulated. One of them is obviously people can actually shop around for systems of governance in various ways. Like when we were talking last week about trading platforms. So, whatever sphere you want, some sort of high level, relatively abstracted, highly liquid, sophisticated markets, there is a range of possible trading platforms. Are those trading platforms, in being systems of governance like states? I mean, if they are, then I think we're thinking of states in a way that is unfamiliar and extremely interesting. If a state is basically just a system of governance that we could potentially shop around between, so states kind of set up governance systems and people move in and out of them by these market processes of exit and entry, and therefore select between states, then for sure I can buy the thing then. But how is that different from a platform? How is that, wouldn't that be to think of a state basically as being a trading platform?
Well, and it's interesting that like the precise point where the current state does start to behave like a trading platform, which is sort of the purchasing of judges and officials, or the contribution of money to very different, or not even necessarily very different, but to particular regimes or campaigns, as a sort of arbitrary or semi-arbitrary platform for pursuing policy that benefits you. And this is whether you're the cartel purchasing drug policy that benefits your business, or you're the Koch brothers or whoever. That precisely at the point where it starts to act like an semi-arbitrary platform for user operations, it is market-like, and it involves money and where you choose to spend your money.
Yeah. But actually, I mean, I think small states all have to basically behave like trading platforms. You know, big states don't, much less. But I think when we look at that heritage index and all the top 5, you know, freest economies in the world are tiny little countries. You know, it's like obviously Hong Kong, Singapore, New Zealand, Switzerland. It's because those, if you're a small state, you're selling yourself as a trading platform. And if you don't work as a trading platform, you hemorrhage people and capital, and everything leaves and goes to an alternative trading platform.
Because
the fact, from the point of view of a big state, it doesn't look like that. But I think that's a kind of weird distortion that comes from the fact abnormal magnitude that it just hides.
That definitely makes sense in terms of sort of, because there were 2 different senses of the state as a trading platform kind of there, and one of them was the one you're making with these small states that converge on banking or on being a place where you incorporate your business or whatever. And then it's sort of the state policy itself as enacting a trading platform and being sold as, like, you know, an off-the-shelf jurisdiction kind of thing, versus with these big states, you get the government of the state itself precisely by sort of the value of being able to determine policy for these really large territories or groups of people.
Right. Yes.
You know, comes that trading platform. Horse trading, as they say.
Yes, it becomes obscurely commercialized for sure everywhere. Right. Yeah, but it is much more obscure, isn't it? I mean, I think I'm trying to think where this word came out. I think it might have been in this same talk. I think it's a really crucial term, and we came across it in the previous call. Sovereignty services. You know, when you're a microstate, you're, let's say, some little Caribbean country, you're selling sovereignty services. You know, all those distinctive characteristics that make you a state rather than a product are encapsulated in that term. And so you're functioning surely as a platform there. You know, you can be used to register shipping. You can be used for offshore banking and finance services, or all of these various things. And your very survival depends upon your functionality as a commercial platform. You see, I mean, the point, my concern with the way it's a triadic thing that Ben was setting up with it is, I just think they melt together so much. I mean, there's no market that isn't a platform, surely, and I would say there's no state that isn't a platform. It's just that it's hard to see when you have abnormally large concentrated political entities. But they're still serving as a trading platform. It's just that they can get away with being a far more dysfunctional one than is possible for a small state.
Well, and you could also articulate, this is sort of just like a sort of orthogonal articulation, is that sheerly by virtue of having survived and grown to that level and sustained themselves at that kind of growth, maybe grossly abnormal or not, whatever size, they have more path dependency in the course of growing to that size and of becoming stable at that size. You see more and more layers of these historical compromises and these different ways of bribing populations.
Right.
I mean, you see that in the structure of Roman governments, first of all, where to establish, you know, even the base core of Rome, they had to unite, they had to bribe 19 different tribes on the Italian peninsula and integrate them one by one, and then you end up with this enormously bizarre sort of congressional system that we then just readily, and use for a platform for the same sort of path-dependent compromises.
Yeah. So it's kind of institutional inertia in a way that is part of that, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. It also creates, I mean, inertia is also conservation of momentum that's already been established. So I mean, you think in the Roman case that they went on to be such, so extraordinarily effective, like not even, like it's not the conquering of the territory that's so much extraordinary as like the ability to integrate it across like pretty like radical cultural differences, like military detail differences and so forth, and just to sort of, I don't know how exactly you would draw a structural line between them, but to relate this to sort of the initial consolidation process in the Italian peninsula, which, wasn't really one tribe conquering everybody. It was this sort of progressive rolling integration of different like small micro territories and groups and so forth. And to see that as like, a destining that comes through that particular path dependency to the future history of the empire. And then the American case as well.
Sorry, say more about the American case. Like,
I was sort of trying to think it out. I mean, part of it is definitely this is the stuff about the frontier and the frontier constituting American society that we had talked about in the last class. But another is this this giant political and cultural issue, which is the continental interior versus the unity of the two coasts. And I think there's so many features of that were destined by the process that the specific process of the consolidation of the American state as this like progressive movement westward, followed by like a secondary wave of political consolidation, so that by the time the wave finally reaches the West Coast, things like trains and telegraph and so forth that then shorten that distance to the wealthy base in the East Coast dramatically. By the time the territorial extension got there, sort of, I mean, it has these long-term knock-on effects, like creating this sort of cultural unity between coasts versus this much like sparser, culturally different like interior heartland, which then sets up for political divide, like giant political divides and destinies, which are like really operative right now, where you see very literally like two contiguous bands of blue, diametrically opposite each other across a continent, central corridor of red. Like, just to see that is to see that the process by which America consolidated itself. I mean, the path dependency of it, like, I don't know how many other examples of like the continental interior naturally promoting cultural separation from opposite coasts. Like, I don't know how many other examples of something like that there would be. So maybe you could make an argument that it's not a very specific path dependency there. But I mean, it seemed, I have no idea where I even started with this, to be honest.
No, it's complicated. I think to me, one of the things that's kind of haunting this discussion is this question about like divergent and convergent evolution. Like, to go back to what you were saying, it's like if you have a long pedigree to whatever your system is, and it seems to have this greater embedded path dependency, and therefore greater resistance to horizontal substitution is part of that, isn't it? Like, I mean, I'm assuming part of the difference in this, like, we're kind of just make it super contemporary, and all these maps everyone's seen about the last political distribution of America now, as we've seen it from this last election. So what is dividing these blue zones, which are partly, yes, these coastal strips, they're partly just these urban hubs, aren't they? I mean, I've seen some really striking diagrams that just show the kind of red-blue vote in terms of the degree of urban intensity. And the urban zones, it seems to me, at least partially, are these, what does it mean to say, you think of all the kind of colloquial political language around them, to do with like cosmopolitanism, rootlessness, you know, a lack of tradition. I think there's a lot that could probably be slotted into this. Well, what's at stake there is that there's a system of horizontal substitutability that you find in these metro zones that doesn't transplant into the hinterland. So
I mean, like in terms of goods, like availability of many brands, or availability of, like, you know, many origins of worker. Or,
yes.
or like
So the point is, if some, it goes back to this path dependency process, that if something in a metro center is its selective environment is global, cosmopolitan, and is all the other big metro centers of the world, you know, if Hong Kong does a skyline better than you, then maybe you end up importing a Hong Kong skyline, or you end up importing the cuisine of some region because it outcompetes you, or you import any kind of social, technical, cultural practice from any of these hubs that are in horizontal communication, and kind of in a mutually competitive environment, whereas the hinterland is in this much more I don't want this to sound like a kind of again a kind of morally weighted term, but inertial pattern, isn't it? The path dependency is much stronger because it's not in this situation of kind of potential substitution. Like,
right, I mean, that makes, if you think of it as the establishment of a continuum, or the convergence on a continuum, which is sort of made possible by having the same means of transit and the same sort of speed and liquidity of transit via the ocean, and, you know, and then money concentration in urban areas and everything. If you have, like, just sheer distance of transaction times, like difficulty of accessing the same pool of horizontal substitution, like, means that you can't form a continuum. You're going to diverge from the continuum established. Or you could say that that continuum is a divergence from, like, local, continental, territorial hinterlands. Or what
yes,
becomes of them.
or those kind of path-dependent continua are subject to kind of horizontal selective pressure of an extreme kind, aren't they? And so unless they can actually sell themselves within this commercium, this global inter-hub commercial network as being viable, plausible, functional, contemporary solutions, then they will tend to extinction within those zones.
Right.
Whereas in the hinterland, that there's much less prospect of that. I mean, this is just the path dependency. Is just like this is our tradition. This is where we've come from. That's not gonna change because of the fact that the hinterland of some other country does things a different way. There's no system of sort of a kind of effective substitutive comparison taking place on that level.
Right. And you could also argue, sort of partially, I think, from the reactionary perspective, that in that hinterland, rather than like horizontal competitive survival, it's sort of vertical is not quite the term I'm looking for, but time survival, you know, because of lack of access to money and like fungibility of resources depending on how the weather goes, assuming like the hinterland is more agrarian, more subject to these sort of punctual disruptions of the ability to sustain the line, right? Like line sustaining things like these path dependencies are higher, more preferentially valued.
So very, very, very crudely, there's a kind of diachronic process in the hinterland and a synchronic one in the urban cores, isn't there? to some degree. Like in urban cores, if someone somewhere else is putting together a widget in a better way than you're putting together that widget, you will end up converging on the best way of putting that widget together wherever it comes from. But in the hinterland, someone's folk music tradition is just not in synchronic competition with your folk music tradition. I mean, they just are not. They're non-interfering, irrelevant things. It's your folk music tradition is in relation to the urban cultural acoustic tradition, or even if tradition is the right word, rather than in this relation of synchronic competitive
and that, you see
relation.
Concerns about dying out. I mean, being so dominant, like especially as soon as like the hinterland really, I think, it seems to discursively encounter this opposition to the urban, like all of your, or a huge proportion of being about languages dying out, traditions dying out, music styles dying out. I think is actually a pretty good example of where, a folk music tradition might be at constant risk of dying out because of a generational gap or something if it doesn't have these very, very consistent standards. So I think that fits the diachronic synchronic opposition. But I think Theo has a good point in the sidebar here as well. The sort of urbanity as infrastructural standard, which I think is interesting from the urban region's own area of deep path dependency is this layering of infrastructure over time, and this the difficulties that presents for massing a population that's constantly changing and growing over time. And I don't know, I think this creating in urban areas a greater understanding of the need for convergence on standards that are maybe somewhat arbitrary or not what any one group sees as being centered on them, just because of the sheer difficulty and path dependency involved in living with 10 million other people in a place the size of what would be a county in the hinterlands.
Well, I think the urban zones are prepared to swap out chunks of this infrastructure with a willingness that is deeply disconcerting to hinterland populations, because the American example is so sort of heated and tormenting to people. I mean, it's useful to just go back to 19th century China, and the status in people's imagination of a city like Shanghai, where the fact that in Shanghai, because it's a global hub, because people have this set of sort of synchronic global comparisons of the way things are done, they will just swap out some chunk of local culture and replace it with something within the cosmopolitan shopping mart, in a way that for the traditional population, for the hinterland population, is actually upsetting to the point of being considered treacherous. I think there is this sense that for the hinterland, the urban population are ethnic traitors because of the fact that they are prepared to just replace these chunks of kind of socio-cultural process within this synchronic competitive system in a way that's just absolutely unimaginable for someone in this more lineal,
right, in such a radical sense that it's just substitution with a void, because there's nothing strong enough with strong enough synchronic access to actually replace it. So the very thought of this being a replaceable and eliminable, substitutable thing
is unimaginable.
Introduces a blank in imagination, something like that.
Cities are also, they tend to be built in platformy ways that allow those substitutions, right? There's this example of the Manhattan grid and Rem Koolhaas. The grid is itself a sort of platform that allows substitutability, and you can substitute what's happening on a particular floor of a skyscraper in Manhattan, very independently of what's happening on the next floor down.
Right, right. So like sort of modularization is part of that, isn't it?
Right.
Yeah. So I was being yeah.
I was just going to give a time check here. We're 5 to 1 right now.
Yeah. Actually, I should, if I was being responsible, have kind of a strong sense of agenda for next week, but I have to confess, I don't really, actually. I haven't. I was just concentrating on what we were up to right now. I'm slightly losing track even where we are. We've got 2 more weeks of this module, is that right?
Technically, this is the 3rd session. So we should have, we have 4 more scheduled, or is that right? Yeah, 4 more scheduled.
And 1 more.
And 1 more that wasn't done initially. Yeah.
Right, okay, yeah.
So perhaps like in the Google Classroom, we can start a conversation with everyone about what's the best day to try to fit that extra day in. I think after the, was it the 10th of December? Is that, or let me just double check the date really quick. So if the 10th of December is the scheduled last day right now, that's a Saturday. After that, I think people have said it'll be more difficult to do the week after. Is that what people said?
Yeah.
But we should start like a conversation maybe about
okay.
What's another date.
Yes, let's do that. Let's do that. I'll be more attentive to that space and
Great.
Get a sense of what people are up to and thinking on this. Yeah.
Oh, and Chuggies did post a reading earlier that we were talking about. Was that the one that you were looking at, Nick?
There's a giant Chuggies sidebar comment that I was trying to just scan for, but I think I need to read it properly. This is Bojar from Bojar on Simondon.
I mean, if there's a particular way people want to relate Simondon to this, I mean, it's very close in all the sort of technical object evolution. Then I'm keen to dig into that too.
Okay, that's good. I mean, my inertial course, I think, is one of the things I'll do is actually talk a bit about the geology of morals essay next week. But I think if people want to bombard the session with Bojo and Simondon and all of this kind of material, then it's great for that to happen. And let's just sort of see what kind of resources can be pulled out of these different discourses. I think that would be good. But I'm seeing the next week as a kind of is the final one in this initial stage of Qwernomics understood as a socio-historical and economic cybernetic process. It's like we're in the mode of what I call Qwernomic materialism, like understanding the whole QWERTY issue as indicative of certain techno-economic dynamics. And then subsequent to that next week, that's the week after next, I think we go into a mode that is more specifically like semiotic, and is about what actually is QWERTY. Like what are we seeing? What is this system? What are its rules? How can we describe it, abbreviate it? What kind of patterns are we looking at when we see this system, this weird little microcultural system that we've inherited?
Great. And is now a good time to wrap up then?
Yeah, one last wave of chances for suggestions or remarks from people, and I think that's us done.
Great.
Okay, so I'm going to gather by the fact that everyone's quite quiet now that we're done. Is everyone happy to wrap up at this point? Okay, I will take that as a yes. Okay, great.
Super.
Great to talk to you all as usual.
Yeah, take care.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good night.
Okay, have a good week.
You too.